For the sake of privacy, I'm going to call myself Howard. A few years ago, I'd say this would have been around late 2018, so I was about 13. Me, my mom, my stepdad, and my grandmother all spend the weekend at my mom's friend's house, which sits about a mile off the coast of Lake Huron in northern Michigan. I was extremely nervous since my mom told me it was a heavily forested area. I was scared of the wolves and or bears that live up there, and I love forests, just not the things that live in them. Kept telling my family I don't want to go, there could be something in the woods there. Either my mom or my stepdad would try to comfort me by saying something like, "It'll be fine, if anything happens, we'll protect you." Or, "There's a lot of us, nothing would be brave enough to fight us," which kind of helped because turned out there would have been a lot of people there, 7 people and the 4 of us. It was about 5 p.m. and we left our house in the southern regions of Michigan, and it was about 8 p.m. when we arrived. It was the lake house in the outskirts of Bay City. When we got there, I was reminded of my fear from earlier. The house sat in a large clearing and was surrounded by miles of forest on all sides. I got a sense of dread at the sight, but I tried to ignore it. I met the friends and they were pretty nice. I got pizza from the local pizza place and I mostly forgot about the forest. I was sitting in the kitchen watching YouTube on my phone. They were all hanging out in the basement where there was a TV, a pool table, and all sorts of cool stuff. It was just after 11 p.m. when I heard something scraping up against the wall outside on the other side of the stove. I was sitting a good 10 feet from the said stove. For perspective, the main floor sat about 5 feet off the ground, and there were stairs that led up to a small porch. I noticed the sound when the video I was watching ended. It sounded like multiple shard things scraping against the wall. I was too scared to look for the cause of the sound. Suddenly the sound stopped and it walked into the backyard. It was a deer. I was immediately relieved as I was taught deer were a symbol of peace and freedom, so I smiled as it pranced into the forest beyond the backyard. My mom asked if I was okay, saying I still looked spooked. I told her the truth. I heard scraping outside, but it was just a deer. She chuckled. "Oh yeah, I've heard their antlers scraping against stuff so many times, and it startles me every time." Then she told me they were all going to bed, and so did I. I went to the bed on the couch in the living room, and I brought my Jurassic World blanket. I slept rather well despite my fear of the surroundings. The woman, my mom's best friend at the time, the person she came to see specifically, who for the sake of privacy we'll call Carissa, woke me up saying, "Hey Howard, wake up buddy, it's bright outside." I got up rather quick since I still didn't fully trust the place. I checked my phone and it was somehow 2 p.m. I guess I slept in. I went outside and they had a cute husky named Blitz. I played with him for at least 2 hours. He was super playful. He had a soccer ball he liked fetching, so I made him fetch the ball for a while. We then went to the lake, all 10 of us, but I didn't want to go. I'm not a social person, but my mom gave me no choice. One of my worst fears came true. When we got to the beach, the friends had their own friends who had kids. Before I continue, I want to preface this by saying I don't like kids, especially little kids. And that's exactly what they were, 3 little kids. I don't remember how old they were, but they were young, no more than 6. Little kids annoy the hell out of me. I had a cousin in my home state in Tennessee that was half my age, so I know how little kids are. I brought my phone and I just sat just beyond the tree line. The woods were right across from the beach, just a few dozen yards. I was okay with this patch of forest. It was bright as hell and there were so many people there, so I felt safe. And I watched YouTube again. I was sitting there for a good hour and a half, and the minutes that followed was when the strangeness reared its head. I remember every detail of those moments. I was watching the Hodge twins, specifically their video where they read an email from a guy who asked if he should go back to his ex-girlfriend. I was quietly laughing, but my laughter was quickly killed by something deeper in the forest. I heard what sounded like my grandmother calling to me from a few hundred feet away. I was about to get up and follow her voice when I stopped myself because I remembered she was sitting next to my mom on the beach. I could see her in the opposite direction of the voice. The voice sounded slightly off, like my grandmother was out of breath. I could hear her saying something vaguely that sounded like, "Howard, come here, boy," which is something she always says when she needed me. She'd be calling me boy. I noped the hell out of there and went back to my grandmother and sat in the empty chair next to her and told her, "I heard someone calling me in the woods and they had your voice." Her and my mom looked at me in confusion and my mom said, "They sounded like her?" And I explained, "The voice sounded like grandma does when she's out of breath, like when she climbs the stairs to her apartment, exactly the same." They both looked at me like I was an idiot. They said I was making it up and I was trying to just go home, which made no sense to me. Still doesn't make sense. I spent the next 5 minutes insisting that it was true, but they kept saying I was making excuses. But I knew better. I knew exactly what I heard. I sat next to them for the rest of our time at the beach. About an hour later, we headed back to the house. Carissa's friends came with us, the couple with the 3 kids. 5 of us rode in one vehicle, and the others rode in another vehicle. I rode with the people I knew. It was pretty dark by that point, not pitch black, but you still would have needed light to see. We were surrounded by forest for a good minute of the drive back. The tree line was maybe 6 feet away from each side of the van. For the moment, we were surrounded by woods, and I could have sworn I saw a dark figure running with us just beyond the tree line, but I thought my mind was playing tricks on me. It was about a 5-minute drive from the beach to the house. When we got there, the kids raced into the house, playing, being loud and rambunctious and all, and I waited for my mom to go inside before I did, to avoid as much interaction with the kids as possible. Once we all settled in, the parents of the kids told me I should play with the kids since I was a kid too, but I didn't know what to do. So they guided me outside with the 3 little shits, then told us we could play with Blitz. I approached the dog with the kids behind me, and I crouched down and started to pet Blitz. He was really friendly and clearly seemed to enjoy it. He rolled over on his side, wanting me to rub his belly, and so I did. After a minute or 2 of petting him, I grabbed the ball and gestured him to play, but he didn't move. I figured he was too tired. Then when out of nowhere, the oldest of the kids said, "Hey, you stupid dog," and kicked Blitz in the ass. Pretty hard too, clearly annoyed with him for not playing. The dog barked angrily, quickly got up and tried to pounce the boy, but I grabbed Blitz's collar before he could do anything, and the family ran out to see the commotion, and Carissa came to calm the dog down, and the kid was crying his eyes out. I went over to my mom as she asked what happened. I told her the kid kicked Blitz for not wanting to play, and Blitz wasn't having any of it. I told her the kid deserved it, and it seemed like she somewhat agreed with me, saying, "Well, he shouldn't hurt animals like that, or that's gonna happen." They all went back inside, taking the kids with them, and Carissa was mad at the dog for simply protecting himself. I sat next to him and continued petting him, this time for a solid 5 minutes, praising him, calling him a good boy, since it was the kid's fault for being an asshole. I then heard a stick break in the woods about 100 yards away, but it sounded less like a stick and more like a branch being crushed. As soon as I heard the sound, Blitz shot up and stared in the direction of the sound. He got up and sniffed the air and started growling. His fur stood up at a cartoonish level and he was baring his teeth. He scooched next to me, clearly trying to protect me from whatever was over there, and whatever it was clearly a threat. He started barking again, but this time, the barks were out of pure anger. His barks sounded primal. I stood there trying to adjust my eyes to the darkness, trying to see something. My heart was pounding. I thought it was going to explode. Suddenly, Blitz took off into the forest after whatever was there, completely ripping out his tie-out steak. I ran into the house and told everyone that Blitz ran after something in the woods and I couldn't stop him. Then Carissa's husband, I'll call him Steve, and my stepdad. Steve grabbed his rifle from their room and sprinted out the door, followed by my stepdad who got his pistol from the basement as he brought it with him, and they both charged into the woods. They were very fit guys, so I figured they could either shoot or beat up whatever was out there. I thought it was a person or maybe a bear or wolf that was out there. We turned off all the lights in the house, opened the window that faced the direction they went, and we sat there for a good 5 minutes or more. We saw and heard nothing. Another 5 minutes, nothing. After a few more minutes, we heard very faint gunshots coming from the woods. It sounded like he was quite far away. They must have been a mile away by now. Carissa wanted to go out there and look for him, but Steve ordered we stay inside no matter what happens, and my mom reminded her of that. We stayed up for a few hours hoping they would come back at some point, but they didn't. We hesitantly went to bed and I could hear Carissa bawling her eyes out in the basement. I slept on the couch again and I made sure the curtains were closed just in case the stranger returns. It took about 20 minutes to fall asleep, so I decided to listen to some ASMR, specifically Goodnight Moon. If nothing else could bring me comfort, then she can. I woke up early the next morning. I checked my phone and it was 9 a.m. The sun was shining through the cracks of the same, and everyone was still asleep. I got up and let out a big stretch before walking over to the back porch. I opened the curtains and what I saw will haunt me for the rest of my life. I saw Steve and my stepdad, or what was left of them. Whatever that thing was last night, whatever they and the dog went after, it tore them apart. I could barely recognize them. That's how mutilated they were. My stepdad was missing his lower half. His inside were sprawled out all over the place. Steve's throat was torn out, his legs missing, and his chest was torn open. He had huge claw marks all over his body. They both looked like parts of them were eaten by something big. I noticed all of this in the split second that I was staring, and out of shock and disgust, I blurted out, "What the fuck?" at the top of my lungs. That woke up everyone and they all came running up the stairs. It felt like a stampede with all the people running. They all saw the horrifying scene. That moment, everyone started screaming and crying. My mom and Carissa both ran to theirs and held the two men. The mother of the kids kept them back so they couldn't see the death, and her husband called 911. After 10 minutes or so of panic, the cops arrived and we showed them the gruesome scene, and they both gagged and nearly vomited at the sight. They called for the chief and the medical professionals to take care of the bodies. My mom and Carissa sat there next to the bodies, absolutely devastated, crying a river until the paramedics arrived, who then took the bodies away. The cops stayed and questioned us. I didn't hear what the cops asked them, but after some time they started to question me, and since I'm a kid, they took their down stern tone a few notches, and they asked me questions like, "How did you discover the bodies? What happened the night before? And did you hear anything through the night?" And of course I answered truthfully. After questioning everyone, they left and we all sat there in dismay. My mom broke the silence by saying, "What could have done that?" And I told her, no animal could do something like that. My grandmother asked, "Why would the thing leave them there? Is it taunting us?" And after a few minutes of discussion, we decided to Google things like biggest animals in Michigan, bear claw marks, deaths in Bay County, and turns out there were quite a few missing persons reports in the area, and the victims were either found dead, found alive but injured, or never found at all. I had a big imagination growing up, so I googled folk tales from the region and there were a bunch of results. The Michigan Dogman, Bigfoot, the Wendigo, and some other creatures that don't fit the description of what we're dealing with here. I watched the videos on some of these creatures. I watched a video talking about Bigfoot. Definitely not it. Then I watched one about the dog man. The claw marks on Steve and my stepdad were similar, but much bigger and deeper than the video showed. Not it. I even watched a video about skinwalkers, but no, we're too far north for them. Then I watched a video about the Wendigo, and the realization hit me like a freight train. Dear Lord, I thought. I wanted to show the others, but I knew they'd get mad at me and yell at me, so I didn't tell them. I still tried to convince myself it was really just a bear, but I knew better. We then sat in silence for another hour or so. Everyone was crying except me. I didn't know Steve and my stepdad was an asshole, so I was more shocked than sad. The silence was broken again, but by the sound of whimpering outside, we looked outside, and it was Blitz. He was hurt but alive. We all ran outside to greet him as he limped towards the house. He had a claw mark along his body. It ran along the entire side of his body, but it wasn't deep at all. My guess was he just got caught in the crossfire of the confrontation last night. Carissa and the mother of the kids both rushed Blitz to the vet, but don't worry, he survived. After we calmed down from excitement of the dog's survival, we returned to the house and so did the woman after a few hours. I went to the basement after some time and found 3 kids all cowering in the corner, crying. Apparently they saw Steve and my stepdad as the medics put them in body bags. Their mom held them and comforted them, but they never calmed down. We were all in a state of panic. We didn't feel safe in the house at all, and we didn't go outside at all that day. We stayed in the house and watched TV all day, and we didn't eat either. It was around 1 a.m. when we all went to bed, but not me. I've always had really bad paranoia, and tonight, my paranoia was 10,000-fold. I would jump at every sound. The house creaked a lot and it scared me every time. It was maybe 3 a.m. when I heard a familiar sound, antlers scraping along the wall outside. The same wall as the deer from the first night, and a sense of comfort came over me, which was quickly overcame by dread when I noticed the scraping was coming from directly on the other side of the wall. The deer from the other night was scraping its antlers, but it sounded like it was coming from the floor. Since I mentioned the main floor is about 5 feet off the ground, but this time the scraping was coming from directly in front of me, and my heart sank. What can stand 10 feet off the ground? I truly thought it was a bear, but a grizzly bear. They're massive, and it was probably marking the house with its claws. I stood there in darkness and silence, waiting for the sounds to stop, and they did, so I quickly made my way to the back door. I crouched down and peeked through the curtain, oh so slightly. Thankfully, they had lights around the backyard, along the tool shed, along the railing of the back deck. There were even light poles that ran all the way from town into the clearing here, and the moon was fully visible too, so I could see outside very well. What I saw was worse than anything I could ever have imagined. It was a creature that looked like a deer of sorts, but it was more the size of a moose. It had huge antlers, bigger than any cervid should have, its mouth slightly agape. It had razor-sharp teeth. Its head was just the skull, no flesh at all. It had fur along its back that looked matted and worn out and had a dark brown, almost black color. The most striking feature of this thing was its size. It was walking quadrupedal and still seemed to be close to 7 feet tall at the shoulder. I let out a quick gasp. I couldn't control my fear. I must have heard it, because it shot its head back towards the house. I watched in horror as it stood up on its hind legs. It stood there and looked at the house intently, which let me get a good look at this thing. It easily stood 12 feet tall. It looked incredibly scrawny and malnourished. Its arms were long, reaching its knees, and its hands ended with the huge claws. All those features matched that of a Wendigo. At least that's what the video told me. It slowly started walking towards the house. I jumped back on the couch, got under my blanket, and waited for it to go away. heard its footsteps come onto the deck, but its footsteps were incredibly quiet, which explains why I only heard it when it stepped on the branch the previous night. I saw its shadow creep up to the back door. Its shadow consumed the entire curtain. No moonlight peeked through as it just stood there. My heart sank to my stomach when I remembered I didn't lock the back door before trying to go to bed, and as that thought ran through my head, I heard the door slowly open. I felt the cold air rush in as sweat rushed down my body. I could see the breeze hit the curtains. I then saw a head slowly grab the curtain and slide it aside. The creature opened the door fully so it could fit through, and even then its crown of antlers slowly scraped against the doorway as it walked in. It calmly and quietly searched the kitchen, looking everywhere. I could tell it was looking for something. I watched it intently as it skulked through the darkness towards me. As it walked up to me, now merely few feet away, it seemed to stare at me as if it knew I was there, but couldn't do anything. And I noticed it had a nasty bite in its neck. Blitz damn near ripped its throat out the previous night. It had this awful smell of death, like rotten meat and shit mixed together. I could barely keep myself from vomiting on the beast. Then it did something that surprised me. It extended its hand towards me, not like it was inspecting me or toying with me, but it reached out its hand like it wanted me to take its hand. But I learned from the video that the Wendigo loves to trick people, so I just sat there, frozen in fear. I stared at it, its hand still extended, as if things couldn't get stranger. It started talking to me. It had a voice similar to my grandmother's.
"Come with me, boy,"
in the same fashion she always does. But the voice was off. Instead of sounding out of breath, it sounded annoyed, like how she would sound if I was taking too long. I continued to ignore it, which I think pissed it off, because it gave up, put its hands down, and leaned closer to my face. The smell was unbearable. I just laid there and closed my eyes, accepting death. I felt it open its nasty maw to do me like it did Steve and my stepdad. At that moment, I heard someone coming up the stairs from the basement. The beast heard them and ran out the back door, and in a matter of 2 seconds, it had already vanished into the trees. When I got up to close the door, my grandmother and my mom both appeared behind me. My grandmother said, "Why is the door open, boy?" And I replied, "It was hot in here, and no bear is fast enough to get in here before I close it." They both stood in the kitchen getting something from the fridge, and I noticed the beast left a little bit of blood on the floor, which I quickly wiped up with a paper towel. Thankfully, I got rid of it before they saw it. If they saw the blood, there's no way I could have explained myself. They don't believe in monsters. The next morning, I was more than happy to get out of that hellhole. We drove all the 3 hours back home. I can't believe I met the Wendigo. Nothing in my entire life will ever come close to being as scary as that weekend. A few weeks later, we had a closed casket funeral in Grand Rapids, and my mom stopped talking to them after that. I guess there was just too much trauma between them, but they let us have Blitz after that, since our place was much more remote than their place. His scars have healed since then, but his fur is a slightly different color where the scars once were. What was crazy is that about a month after the funeral, Carissa and the whole family went missing overnight. Her friend, the friend's husband, and the 3 kids. Apparently their disappearance was discovered by the same cops that they called that weekend. We read the missing persons report, and all that was found was one blanket and a shoe that belonged to one of the kids. The house was resold about 2 years ago. God forbid the new family has a run-in with that monster. I bought this house 8 months ago to be closer to my son and his mother. His mom and I don't have a great relationship. We hardly speak, but I wanted to be nearby my son in case of an emergency, and driving 2 hours out to this shitty Bumble town to pick him up every other week got old real fast. So I bought the house. I thought I got a good deal. 2 bed, 2-bath on a decent amount of land with an old barn and a boarded up well out back. If any of you have been trying to buy a house the past few years, you'll know how competitive it is. In an idiotic attempt to impress the seller, I waived the inspection. Never waived the inspection. The house was falling apart, foundation was crumbling, termites in the subfloor, leaky roof, water damage because of the leaky roof. I was hemorrhaging cash just trying to get the place livable, but I was close to my son and the ever-growing to-do list kept me busy, which was nice in a boring country town like this. A few weeks went by and the house became livable enough for me to feel comfortable, allowing Theo, my son, to spend the night in the new house. The time, money, and effort I spent on the shitty little house were all worth it in those short weekends that I had custody. We slid around the hardwood floors in our socks, played hide and seek in the dilapidated barn, and at night we laid in the middle of the giant backyard and stared up the infinite number of stars in the dark rural sky as fireflies floated around us. He loved it, so I loved it. Eventually my to-do list arrived at fill in the well. I mean, what was I going to do with an old dried up well in the backyard? I'm not a farmer, and I'm pretty sure the water isn't safe to drink if there's still water in there. The well added nothing but risk. What if Theo fell in while we were playing hide and seek? I approached the well for the first time since buying the house. It sat about 50 yards from the backup from the house, behind the old barn. It was a small ring of gray stone that rose about 3 feet out of the earth around it. It was covered with a rotting plywood lid, on top of which stood a pile of dirt and stones to weigh it down. I never should have taken the lid off the damn thing. I pushed the stones off the side and pulled the plywood off the stone opening of the well. I peered over the side and immediately felt a jolt of cold lightning shoot through my body as I saw a shadowy face staring back up at me from the bottom. A moment passed before I realized it was my own face staring back up at me, reflected off of the black water at the bottom of the old well. I had been expecting the well to be dry by how old it looked. I guess it had to be at least 70 years old and the water table should have dropped by now. I took another long look down the well at the black water so far below. I realized I didn't have the tools or know-how to pull this job off and started to back away from the well when a few bubbles floated to the surface of the dark water. I watched as the bubbles dissipated and the surface of the water returned to its smooth mirror-like stillness. A few days after I pulled the lid off that well, my tools went missing. I kept them in the barn out back and couldn't find them when I went out back to grab a handsaw. I chalked that one up to me being a bit too trusting of my new country neighbors. I figured crime wasn't just a city issue after all. I spent what little money I had on some new tools and a padlock for the barn. A few weeks later, the padlock went missing along with my new tools. This time I called the police, who couldn't do much other than to file a report. I couldn't afford new tools, I was barely keeping my head above water with house payments, and I spent most of my savings on home improvements. That's what I get for buying a house when interest rates are through the roof, I guess. The next thing to go missing was my son's bike. We usually left it propped up on the side of the house, but one morning I woke up and it was gone. This really pissed me off. For the next few nights I stayed up late peeking out of windows with my phone in hand ready to call the police. I saw it for the first time a little after 3 a.m. I heard footsteps in my backyard and I crept towards the rear of the house and looked out the window. I saw the black outline of a man obscured by shadow as he slipped into my now unlocked barn. A moment later, I saw him re-emerge from the barn dragging the only tools I had left in there, my shovel and a sledgehammer. I picked up the phone to call 911 when the man did something strange. He walked over to the well and tossed a shovel down the well shaft. I put down the phone and watched the man curiously as he heaved the sledgehammer up over his shoulder, then tossed it down the shaft as well. I stood there watching the man, furious. Getting stolen from is one thing, but for someone to take your things only to destroy them, that was frustrating. especially since I didn't know anyone in the area. Who would do that to me? I got a hold of my anger and started to dial when I saw the man sit himself on the stone lip of the well, then without warning or hesitation fall backwards into the well shaft. Instinctively, I rushed to help the man, grabbing a flashlight on my way out of the house. I reached the well and called out to the man before shining a beam of light down the deep abyss, only to see the light reflected off of smooth, black water. I phoned the police, who arrived 15 minutes later. I told them the story, and within an hour they had jerry-rigged a ramshackle pulley system and were lowering someone from the rescue team down into the well. I'll spare you the details, but they found nothing. No shovel, no sledgehammer, and no body. In addition to that, I got slapped with a hefty fine for abusing emergency services, but I know what I saw. Thank God Theo wasn't staying with me that night. Things kept going missing. I wasn't sleeping. I'd stay awake for days at a time watching my property, only to eventually doze off. I'd wake up the next morning with my garden hose and wind chimes missing. One morning I woke up to find 2 of the tires had gone missing off of my truck. I lost my job the morning of the truck incident. My performance had been slipping, and me not showing up to work, that day was the final nail in the coffin. As if I wasn't stressed enough. The one thing that kept me sane was Theo. I craved the weekends he stayed with me, but I was even failing in that category. I was too stressed to laugh at his jokes and too tired to play games. Once while playing hide and seek, he told me to sit on the couch and count to 100 before looking for him. I fell asleep before I got to 30. That one ruined the entire weekend. I felt like such a shit dad. I was burning through what little savings I had and decided I need to sell the house. Too bad no one wants an overpriced fixer-upper in this market, especially not in this town. I was trapped. Felt like I was suffering under the weight of my own life. I tried to live simply. I had a good job. I didn't lavish my son with the gifts he deserved, and still I felt like I was getting priced out of just existing. I made up my mind, no more worrying about the well man. I'd go to sleep early, send out constant stream of resumes from 8 a.m. until 5 p.m., and I would make an effort to make Theo's weekends at my house as much fun as possible for him. I was going to reinvent myself, turn a tragedy into opportunity, take control of my life. I woke up that night to a loud boom. I slowly rose from bed, thinking Theo had just knocked a chair over trying to get to the cookies on top of the fridge, like he had so many times in the past. I sat there at the foot of my bed and took a moment to fully wake up so I could coherently parent. It had been a while since I had gotten a full night of sleep. I was exhausted. I looked at the clock and saw a big red 3:16 shining back at me. I walked out of my bedroom and was confronted by a scene that turned my blood cold. The front door had been kicked in. Splinters of wood were strewn across the living room, and I saw through the open door large, wet footprints that led up to the porch, into the house, and down the hallway into Theo's room. Quickly but silently, I grabbed a kitchen knife and tracked the footprints to Theo's room and pushed the door open. Theo was lying in bed, still asleep but without covers. His blanket was missing along with some of the stuffed animals he usually cuddles with. I quickly retraced the footsteps back outside just in time to see the black silhouette of a man toss an armful of blankets down into the well before jumping in after them. I went back into the house, barricaded the door, put another blanket on my son, and waited for the sun to rise. When Theo's mom came to pick him up the next day, I told her that Theo wouldn't be able to stay with me for a few months. I would be traveling for work, then the house would be getting an extensive remodel, so it wouldn't be safe for him to be here with all the power tools, exposed wires, and nails. She was more than happy to take him away from me and didn't ask any questions. Like I said, we don't have a good relationship. Saying goodbye to Theo was tough, but he didn't understand what was happening. He just asked if we could camp in the barn when he came back. I agreed. My plans to reinvent myself were put on an indefinite hold. I was back to obsessing over the well man. How could I not? He just broke into my home and took the covers off of my sleeping child. Playtime was over. As soon as Theo and his mom pulled out of the driveway, I marched over to the well and covered it with the plywood lid that had previously capped it. I spent 2 full hours searching for large rocks to weigh the lid down with. The lid bowed under a mountain of rocks by the time I was done. With that taken care of, I went to work fixing my front door. Couldn't afford a repairman or any materials, but I managed to get it fixed up well enough to have it be able to lock again, not that it really helped much. Exhausted, I fell asleep early that night. A week passed without an incident. I started a job search, but I was still short on funds, so I started selling off some possessions to help pay the mortgage. My collection of silver dollars was enough to pay the mortgage for a month, but the bills were stacking up. Internet, electricity, gas, trash, water. I sold some kitchen appliances and my Xbox to help pay for those. I walked into town and started passing out my resumes at restaurants and local hardware stores in an attempt to secure some sort of income, no matter how meager. I finally landed a gig at a honey-baked ham shop in the back preparing food. $10 an hour for 30 hours a week. It would cover a good portion, but not all of my mortgage. It would have to do. It was back-breaking work, 6 hours a day of carving up ham legs, sawing through femur bones in a blazing hot kitchen, but it bought me time to find another job. I could also sneak some food out every now and then so I wouldn't have to worry about dinner. By the time I got home every night, I was wiped out and covered in meat juice and bone marrow. I'd shower and immediately pass out. I was so tired I didn't even wake up the next time the thing came into my house. I woke up in the morning to again find my front door kicked in and the same watery footsteps charting a path from the front porch and into my living room. This time it took my television. I walked out into the backyard and found the lid I had placed on the wall had been pushed over. I flew into a rage. What was this thing? Was I going crazy? This had to stop. I couldn't just wait for this thing to clean me out. I walked back into town and went to the hardware store where I had just tried to get a job a few days before. I bought a sledgehammer on credit and dragged it all the way back to my house where I took to dismantling the well. I hammered the side of that well with the sledgehammer for nearly 30 minutes before I realized I wasn't making any progress. No matter how hard I hit it, that small circle of stone stayed intact. I couldn't even find a place where I'd chipped one of the stones. Defeated, I dropped the sledgehammer on the ground where I stood and went to get ready for work. The sledgehammer was gone when I woke up the next day. I started getting paranoid again. I felt like a rat in a maze, or more accurately, like Theseus in King Minos' labyrinth. Lost, afraid, and knowing that trapped in here with me is a monster that I'll have to battle in order to survive. I kept grinding at work and I kept selling off more possessions to survive. Golf clubs, microwave, extra linen, love seat, now empty TV stand were all sold to help cover the bills. It wasn't long before the house was nearly empty. I still had a refrigerator, a simple wooden chair, and a few pots and pans. My bedroom consisted wholly of a mattress on the ground with my clean clothes stacked neatly in one corner of the room and my dirty clothes thrown in a pile in another corner. If I didn't get an offer on the house or a better job soon, I'd run out of cash within 2 months. Things were desperate. One night as I lay in bed thinking about how badly I'd fucked up my life, I heard it. Heavy footsteps paced around the outside of my house, accompanied by a low groaning that was barely audible. I sat up in bed and strained my ears to listen. The footsteps circled my small house once, then I heard 2 heavy footfalls on the front porch. It was here. I left my bedroom and stood in the foyer, frying pan in hand, ready to launch an attack at the thing that had ruined my life as soon as it walked in. The wet footfalls continued up the porch and stopped at the front door, which now, due to extensive damage, was not able to lock. I stood in silence and held my breath, having no clue what to expect to see walk through my front door in a matter of seconds. I had seen it before. It had the shape of a man, but I could never see more than its silhouette, and I knew whatever was about to walk in my home was no man. I raised the frying pan above my head in anticipation. The door creaked as it slowly swung open. Standing in my door was a man. He was still silhouetted against the porch light, but it was the best view of him I had seen so far. He was dripping wet and caked with mud. His ghost white skin was swollen and was dotted with large black patches of decomposition. His clothes had deteriorated to rags. His lips and the tips of his fingers were blue as if he was hypothermic. He stared at me with dead, milky eyes. I froze. My plan of attack evaporated before it even started. I was expecting to see something mystical, otherworldly, impossible. But expecting to see something and actually seeing something are two totally different things. You never know how you might react when a dead man walks into your foyer. The dead man took a wet, squishy step into my home, and then another. It was then I finally managed to break free from my stupor and rushed at the dead man with a frying pan. I swung down on the man's head, intending to cave it in. A wet, clammy hand rushed to meet mine and he caught me by the wrist. The man's other hand grabbed me by the throat and lifted me off my feet. That's all I remember. I woke up the next morning with a blinding headache on the floor of the foyer. The door was still wide open. My house was empty. It took everything it could find. No mattress, chair, fridge, clothes, nothing. Even the shower curtain was missing. All I have left is the phone I'm writing this on. I don't even have the charger. That was 3 days ago. Do you know why we throw coins into wishing wells? Ask anyone and you'll get a different answer. Sometimes they'll tell you it's because fairies live there. Sometimes it's a show of respect for the value of the life-giving resource of water. But I know the real reason. It's an offering, a tribute, a payment to keep whatever is down there from crawling back up and taking it from you. I realize this now. Pity it's too late for me to do anything about it. I have nothing left to keep the beast at bay. It's inside my house now. I can see its shadow under the crack of my bedroom door. With any luck, it will just take my phone, but I have a feeling it wants more. It's already taken everything from me. If any of you read this, send a couple prayers up for Theo. I'm sorry we won't get to camp in the barn. A funny thought just came to me. I have life insurance. I'm technically worth more dead than alive.
Goodbye.
Two years ago, my friend went missing from a hotel. I've been looking for her ever since. I'm sharing this because if I don't come back, well, the more people that know what happened, the better. Maybe then, someone will finally believe us. Every year since our college graduation, my best friend Liz and I would go on a vacation together and visit a new city. As we were planning the trip for late summer 2021, she got an email saying she'd earned a free week-long stay at a hotel. She tends to travel a lot for business, so it's not too unusual for her to get a free night every now and then. One of the locations she could redeem it at was somewhere we hadn't been before, and it looked ritzy. It sounded perfect. As soon as we walked into the lobby though, something felt off. Don't know how to explain it other than it had weird vibes. It looked like an old building that had been recently renovated, but the bright colors, lights, paintings, felt like someone had just slapped a thin, cheery veneer over decades worth of caked on misery. The air just felt heavy. Liz didn't seem to notice it, at least not at first. The guy at the check-in desk stared at us for a while muttering that he needed to talk to his manager. We were a bit worried that we were about to hear that the email she'd received had been a scam, but to our relief, he came back with a grin and said they'd upgraded our room. The city skyline and faint mountains in the distance that we could see from our window won me over. That first day was fine, but when I woke up the next morning, Liz was sitting motionless on her bed, her back to me. Liz? I repeated her name several times before finally walking over to tap her on the shoulder. Hey. She finally turned to me, spoke quietly as if someone else might be listening. Did you hear it last night? I shook my head. Oh. She looked embarrassed for a moment, like she was unsure if she could continue. I couldn't sleep, not with the scratching behind the wall, she whispered eventually. I don't like it. I'm a heavy sleeper, a bit too heavy, honestly. At home where it's just me, I have to set multiple alarms to make sure I wake up on time for work, and I've literally slept through a fire alarm once. Luckily, it was a false alarm. Liz was the opposite. Every little noise would wake her, so she always tended to have a rough first night or two as she became accustomed to the new sounds of a place. I thought maybe after a couple of nights she'd get used to it or chalk it up to the building settling, especially in such an old place. I offered to ask for a different room, but she was worried they'd charge us. She said just try and ignore it. The day before we were supposed to check out though, she shook me awake. Her eyes were wide and frantic as she stood over me. She'd moved her nightstand aside and was pointing at a small door, 3 or so feet tall, that had been behind it. The door was old looking, dark wood with an antique knob, and stood in contrast to everything else in the bright and modern looking room. Did you open it? She looked at me like I was out of my mind for even asking, and backed away as I approached it, for good measure. I figured that once we looked, we'd both feel better. I was wrong. As I carefully pushed it open, the smell of rust and bleach hit me immediately. The narrow space was long. It went further back than my phone light could reach from where I stood. After a few feet, it faded into blackness. Since it was only as tall and wide as the small door, I realized I'd have to crawl on my hands and knees to see how far it went back. I hate being in the dark and can't stand small spaces, but when I looked over my shoulder at Liz and saw the bags under her eyes, the expression on her face, I figured I'd owed it to her to at least take a look. So I crawled in. Once I was a few feet inside, I saw the small and narrow space ended at another wall, one plastered in yellowing wallpaper. It looked so old, I guess it was probably part of the original hotel. The dark patterned carpet was dotted with stains, which seemed to be contributing to at least part of the strong smell. As I backed out, I thought I heard a faint whisper coming from behind the old wallpaper in front of me. As soon as I was all the way out, I had to fight the urge to slam the door shut and run. It felt so wrong in there. I wasn't sure what the purpose of that space had been, but even then I knew it was nothing good. Hey, I whispered as soon as the door was closed, as I tried to nonchalantly move the end table back in front of it. Why don't we pack up? We can find a different hotel for tonight. She seemed a bit calmer and said she could hang in there for the final night. After having been in that small space behind her wall, the thought of sleeping there another night honestly freaked me the hell out. But I figured that if she could make it through the last night, then so could I. After we turned out the lights that night, I remember seeing her dark silhouette sitting on the edge of her bed motionless until I fell asleep. That was the last time I ever saw her. When I woke up, it was almost noon. Both of our alarms were blaring. We were supposed to check out hours earlier. My confusion quickly turned to panic when I realized Liz wasn't in the room. Her suitcase, purse, phone, everything was still there. The main door was locked and chained from the inside too. At first I couldn't think of where else she could be, until it hit me. There was one place I hadn't checked. The nightstand was still in front of the door, but I was fairly certain it was in a slightly different spot than we had left it the day before. Reluctantly, I slid it aside. Liz? No answer. She wasn't there. I did see, though, what I thought it had been a wall was open slightly. I pushed it tentatively and took a sharp breath when I saw it led into a tunnel. It went so far back, far beyond the reach of the beam of my phone light. It looked endless. Liz? I got no response other than my own voice echoing through the narrow space. I tried to tell myself that it would be okay. I had to go in, especially if Liz had gone in there too. I took a deep breath, nudged the false wall open all the way, and I entered. As I crawled on my hands and knees, my phone ungracefully held between my teeth, I tried to not think about the tight space and the pitch blackness as far as I could see in front of me, or picture what Liz would have been doing down there. I tried to not focus on the streaks of nearly dried blood along the floor. I had to keep going. I knew that Liz would do the same for me. I realized that I wasn't even sure how long she'd been gone for. I promised myself that the walls were not shrinking around me. It was my imagination, and that this dark expanse couldn't go on forever. Eventually, the tight darkness would end. I kept repeating it to myself over and over as a mantra just to keep myself going, to try and distract myself from the feeling of despair that seemed to fill the place. After what felt like an eternity, the tunnel ended, opening into a room without lights or windows, but it was at least large enough that I could stand and stretch out my cramped muscles. All I could make out was wall-to-wall dark, crumbling bricks and a weak-looking set of stairs that led above and below. It was so quiet there, so eerie. It was easy to forget that I was in a city packed with people, still inside a bustling hotel. When I shined my light upwards into the pitch blackness above my head, I could see the stairs leading to other platforms like the one I was standing on. It looked like the rooms above and below ours had similar tunnels. The smell of bleach had long been replaced by the scent of mildew and old things. It felt so wrong back there in a way that I couldn't put my finger on, that I couldn't help but shiver when wondering why it had been designed that way, what it had been used for. I assumed the stairs to these tunnels above me led to all the other rooms, so I went down, the protesting metal echoing up into the huge empty space above my head. I finally reached a heavy door, and after being in the dark so long, the bright sunlight hurt my eyes when I opened it. I was looking into the back alley outside around the corner from where the hotel seemed to end. The door was covered with the same bricks as the rest of the building. It was so discreet that when I closed it behind me, it blended in perfectly with the outside wall. I remember running back inside and bracing myself against the counter while I tried to convey what I'd found to anyone that would listen. I still have the image in my mind of how the dried blood on my palm stood out starkly on the white marble. It was all I could focus on as the manager tried to calm me down. He said Liz probably just wandered off. People go off on their own all the time to explore the city, he told me. She'd likely come back later. She never did. I was the one that called the police, and the officer that came out chatted casually with the hotel manager for a long time. They checked the room, I showed him the door, but he didn't seem concerned. He just repeated what the manager said. Maybe she just decided to start over and didn't want to be found. I was hysterical, pointed out that her purse and her phone were still in the room. She hadn't even taken her shoes. It's not uncommon, he told me, leaning in a little too close. A warning less subtle than his words was written across his face. For people to visit a city like this and never leave. I drove around for hours asking shop owners and people if they'd seen her, but none of them had. Eventually I had to go home, back to work. The official story is still that she just left on her own volition. I don't believe it, neither does her family or fiance. Every so often, he and I would drive up there just on the off chance that anyone had seen her, but we'd always get the same answer. He's the one that had the idea to book the same room again to see what we could find in the tunnels. He must have called a dozen times. He tried to make a reservation, ask if room 347 or any of the ones directly above it are available, and they'd always tell him no. We hadn't lost all hope, but we'd certainly lost most of it, until a few days ago. I recently received an email invite letting me know I'd earned a free week, just like the one Liz received 2 years ago. I went to check in, and after looking me over, the guy manning the desk said he needed to get his manager. The manager, the same one as before, came out in person, and I was so worried he turned me away, but he simply smiled and informed me that my room had been upgraded. sure you can guess my room number. I've been trying to stay awake each night, although after everything that happened, I wouldn't be able to fall asleep here even if I wanted to. Every night I've just been sitting in the dark, listening to the sounds coming from behind that awful door. Sounds that I could almost swear are a bit louder, a bit closer each night. I'm supposed to check out tomorrow morning. I have a feeling that tonight I'll finally find out what happened to Liz. Wish me luck. When I was younger, around 8 or 9, I went over to my best friend's house for a sleepover. Her parents had recently just gone through a messy divorce, and her mom reached out to mine and thought it was a good idea she had some friends to spend the night with, since she was apparently experiencing frequent night terrors. I only found out about this until later on. We'll refer to her as Elle, so there's about 6 of us, and we're in Elle's attic spending the night. After all the junk food and gossip, we decided to sleep since it was around 3 a.m. Right before deciding to sleep, Elle mentioned the reason why her parents were getting a divorce is because her dad cheated on her mom with the mom's hairdresser, and the mom kicked him out and changed all the locks. She said she was scared of him showing up because of how loud he would always yell. I felt so sorry for her having to go through that. We all tried to make her feel better and safe, but then decided it was time to sleep. I'm usually the last one to fall asleep, so as I was drifting off, I feel someone nudging my shoulder, asking if I'm okay, and I said, "Yeah, I'm fine. Why?" Still with my eyes closed. And the person says, "Wake up. Don't sleep yet. I can't sleep." So I opened my eyes to see Elle standing above me with her eyes closed. Told her she already looked like she's asleep and to go back to bed because I'm too sleepy. She nudged my shoulder again, then started crying loudly and then walked away to her side of the attic and went back in her bed. I looked around thinking everyone would wake up for sure, but no one did, and she stopped crying as soon as she got into bed. I stayed there frozen for so long thinking she would wake up again or do something different. Then I got worried, so I walked over to her side and happened to look outside the window to see a man standing by the tree in their front yard, just standing in all black, and looked like he was waiting. I never made it to her side to check on her. I sprinted back to where I was and just sat there. Needless to say, I never slept that night, and to this day, I'm still confused as to why no one else woke up when she cried, and why she made it to my side without making any noise, seeing as the floor creaked a lot anytime someone moved. She had no idea what I was talking about when I asked her in the morning. Her mom denied everything. I felt like I was going crazy until my mom explained her night terrors to me. She freaked when I told her about the man waiting outside. We assumed it was Elle's dad, but who knows. When my daughter was about 6 weeks old, I woke up to the inside laundry door banging. Now, my husband often left the laundry window open to avoid condensation when the dryer was on, so I assumed it was the wind. But the baby was fussing, so I got up to change her. I had this really bad feeling, but she was fussing, so after hesitating at the bedroom door, I went out to change her anyway because I figured I was just paranoid. Bad dream or something. As I step out the door, I hear this really loud bang of the door. Stuck my head around the corner, and sure enough, it was the laundry door. So I finished changing Bubs, get her settled into bed again, and go and shut the laundry window. Go back to bed. When I got up the next morning, I found muddy footprints all over the lounge room carpet, and our Wii and some other stuff was missing. I realized that when I got up, I disturbed whoever had broken into our house. If I hadn't hesitated at the door, I would have run right into them. God knows what might have happened. I had nightmares for months. Man, that feeling of dread. I've only had it once, but I wasn't alone. I was working in retail liquor in a shop at the entrance to a mall. It was a Thursday night, and I was there with the manager, who was a couple years older than me. I was standing at the counter doing some ordering when suddenly I got this feeling of ominous dread. It felt like a vice on my chest. I looked up and all I could see was people walking out of the mall with their shopping. No one out of the ordinary. The feeling didn't subside, and I was about to go and talk to the manager when she walked up to the counter and without saying a word, took all the cash and the change tin and put it in the safe in the back room. She came out to the counter, looked at me and said, "You feel that too, huh?" We stood there for about 5 minutes as the feeling got worse and worse, and suddenly it was gone. It was like a breeze had blown it away. We both let out a massive sigh and went back to work. She then told me she'd gotten that feeling once before when the store she was working at previously was robbed by a guy wielding a knife. That's why she moved the cash. I have no idea what caused it, but I like to think someone was about to rob us but then decided not to. It was truly bizarre. So, this happened senior year of high school. My best friend and I were at her house, which was way up in one of the canyons, and she had a long, winding driveway. We had been there all day and her mom had gone out. She and I were supposed to go meet a couple of friends in Hollywood that night. Anyways, we had been goofing around all day and watching scary movies and whatnot. We started to get ready. Bathroom had one of those his-her double sink deals, so she was near one and I was at the other. All of a sudden I got the creepiest feeling, like all of the hair on my arms stood up, and I had this sudden feeling of panic. To this day, it was the most terrified I've ever been. I was putting on eyeliner when it happened, and I caught her eye in the mirror and said, "We need to leave, right now." I thought she would be like, "What? You're being ridiculous," or what have you. But instead she said, "I know." My blood ran cold when she said it. We left so quickly that we just grabbed what was in front of us. We booked it out of her house and down the driveway, which we weren't supposed to be on, because her mom had just had it repaved. Her car was parked down the street. We rounded the curve in the driveway and there was a SUV parked dead center in the middle of the street without its lights on. Suddenly the lights turned on full blast. The SUV blared its horn and took off. We scrambled the rest of the way down, totally ruining the new paving, and we're getting into her car and calling the police when her mom pulled up right behind us. To this day I do not know if it was a robber or what. The fact that she and I both got the sense of dread at the exact same time creeps me out to no end. When I was 26 and 6 months pregnant, I went to my dad's house to pick up his mail. My dad was working overseas, but my older and more irresponsible brother was still living there. I had noticed his car was gone, so when I entered the house and heard movement in his room upstairs, I thought it was his girlfriend. As I was rummaging through the mail, I noticed the movement upstairs had stopped, and I heard the floorboards creaking as if someone was trying not to be noticed. Something told me to hide, so I ran down the hall to my dad's room and saw that his window was broken and glass was all over his floor. As I was realizing this, I heard the stairs creaking, so I ran to my dad's bathroom. From there, I had a clear view down the hall to a wall where the landing from the stairs was, and I could see unfamiliar legs with long black basketball shorts and the bottom of a large red t-shirt standing there starting to slowly bend as if to quietly peek down the hall into a room to escape back out of the house through the broken window. Thankfully, he took a chance and ran out the front door. Luckily enough, I didn't lock the front door behind me as I usually do. I don't know what I would have done if I would have had to confront him. It makes me sick to try to imagine the fear a child would have in that situation. Where I grew up in Southwest Houston, which is no stranger to gang activity, especially young teenagers/adults trying to rep street gangs like the Bloods, hence the red shirt. I had never had any negative experiences. However, after that day, I never went back to my dad's house without my husband or brother there. I was born and raised in the country outside a small northeastern Indiana town. I lived in a house that my great-great-great-great-grandfather and his brothers built, as well as 4 other homes directly around my house, where his brothers and their wives lived back in their time. So, by the time I lived in it as a child, it was well into 100 years old, and had been remodeled by my grandma and grandpa in the 1970s. So before we lived there, my maternal grandparents lived there. My grandpa was diagnosed with idiopathic cystic fibrosis of the lungs way back in the early 1980s. I was born in 1989, and in 1990, He was blessed with receiving the first lung transplant in northern Indiana. At a very young age, I have two distinct memories of him being home, with oxygen tubes in his nose and pulling his oxygen tank around the house to sit in his favorite rocker recliner. He passed away in 1991 from rejection. So the creepy part. Back in 2006, I was pregnant with my first child and near my due date. It was during the day and I was really uncomfortable. My hips and lower back were hurting. So I decided to drive to mom and dad's and take a nap in their waterbed, thinking the heat may help. So I get there, and mom and I sat in the kitchen, off from the living room, to talk for a few minutes. During a lull in the conversation, I distinctly hear a squeak, like squeaky tires. I kind of nonchalantly look around to see where the noise could be coming from. I don't see anything. Glance at my mom and she's looking around too. Right as I'm about to ask her if she hears that, I see from the corner of my eye a figure walk past the entryway to the kitchen, walking into the living room. Since I was already looking at mom, hence why I saw it out of the corner of my eye, I could see she definitely saw something, as well as her eyes got that deer in the headlights look, and her face went pale. She looked at me and put her finger over her closed mouth like a shh sound. We both stood up quietly and walked to the kitchen, living room, hall, entryway, and looked into the living room. In the living room, the rocker recliner mom had was rocking back and forth like someone was sitting in it rocking. I looked at mom with a "Are you seeing this?" expression, just in time to see her hands fly up to her open mouth. I snapped my head back around and plainly see my dead, for at this time 15 plus years, grandfather sitting in the chair, rocking for about 2 rocks. I quickly glanced back at mom to make sure she's seeing this, and looked back and he was gone, and the chair was completely still. Legit freakiest thing that has ever happened to me. Was not scared, was just in disbelief. So glad my mom was there, or I would have thought I'd gone insane. Story 2 is completely different. Lived in the same house, except this time I was around 8 to 9, and me and my sister's room were upstairs in our house. My parents' room was downstairs. This particular night, I was sick, and my parents let me sleep on the couch in the living room. Somewhere around 3 to 4 a.m., I remember waking up because I heard someone come in the front door, which opens directly into the living room. I remember opening my eyes to see someone walking through the living room and into the kitchen, and I seemingly fell back asleep for a few minutes. The next thing I knew, I was woken up to red and blue lights flashing through the house. Then I hear my dad and mom's hushed whispers and dad arguing with what sounded like another man. Again, young me just fell back to sleep. Come to find out the next morning, apparently a man who was fleeing the cops pulled into our driveway and walked into our house. Was trying to convince my dad to tell the cops he was his dad and that this was his house. Dad definitely did not do that, and the guy ended up in jail. This didn't happen directly to me, but is still one of the most unsettling events to happen to my family. I was 10 and my brother was 7. During these years, we shared a room with bunk beds. We lived in a 3-bedroom, 2-story apartment. One night, my mother was out on the front porch reading. My little brother runs up to the front door, soaking wet and in his underwear. Understand that the front door was the only possible way he could have gotten outside, and it was locked and deadbolted. He was too small to unlock the ground story windows, and my mother was facing the sliding glass doors, which no one came through. The only remotely accessible second-story windows were locked from the inside. Right after he ran up to the front door, a college-aged kid rode up on his bicycle. Apparently, he had been riding home from work and saw my brother standing in the sprinklers in the elementary school next door to the apartment complex we live in. When he called out to my brother stared and after a few seconds ran off back home. From what my father says about that night, there was literally no way he could have gotten to the front door and unlocked the deadbolt. My dad was in the front hall working on a bookshelf right in front of the front door from the time he put us to sleep to the time my brother arrived. The only things my brother remembers from that night are going to sleep, bright light, and waking up at the school. The event itself is crazy as shit, but what unnerves me is that anyone could have found my brother, but luckily it was a normal, concerned person. I was in Vegas last year with my brother. We both like to party hard, still in our 20s. Walking down the strip, I see two guys with backpacks on. I know what that means. I say, damn, wish we had some weed. They immediately turn around and offer us other things as well. We took down his number to get other things later in the night. Hours later, after tons and tons of booze and stuff, we call this guy up for more. When we met these two guys, they were on foot. The second time though, we had to meet them in front of a hotel because they were driving. So he tells us to hop in for a few so we can get what we need without people watching. Now at this point, my brother and I are fucked up and don't realize what's happening until it starts to get dark. We'd only been driving for 10 minutes, but we were obviously off the strip, away from the lights, people, anything. This guy is driving like a goddamn maniac, with music blasting, so it was a bit distracting. My brother finally asked them where we are going. They say we're heading to a liquor store real quick and then they'll drop us back off, but it seems like we're in the middle of nowhere. Finally realizing the situation we're in, we open the doors while we're stopped at a light and run to the only thing we see, a gas station. We flagged down a cab that drove by a few minutes later, which he says is illegal, but we were obviously in need of help. After we told him what happened, he calmly tells us, "There is no liquor store over here." It was the worst and best feeling ever. We narrowly escaped God knows what and stayed silent for the rest of the night. Too long didn't read. Don't get into the car with strangers, especially while under the influence. Some years back now, my mom went on a vacation with a friend of hers to Florida or somewhere for a week and a half during the winter. So I was alone at home for the time and took advantage of it by setting up my consoles on the big living room TV. One night it was snowing, and throughout the night I felt really uncomfortable. Granted, this was day 6 of 11, and I've never actually been alone in the house for that long before. So I just chalked it up to loneliness. The snow stopped sometime in the middle of the night, and I went to sleep on the couch around 2 a.m. Next morning, plows came down the street and cleared them up as usual. I had left to pick up some stuff at the store down the street, but I stopped almost immediately when I got off my porch. There were footprints in the snow leading up to the large bay window on the side of the house, set leading towards and away. The ones leading in were slightly filled from the snowfall, yet there were 2 footprints positioned right next to the far corner of the window, close to the rear porch and some largish bushes that were finely detailed and pointed towards the wall. Someone had been standing outside the window for a while, at least, staring into my house, and left when the snow stopped. The track started and ended at the street, so where they came from and where they went afterwards were destroyed by the plows. I've since bought large tin sheets to cover said window, hung thick, dark curtains, and rearranged furniture to cover the entire bottom 1/3 of the entire window length. Fuck that shit ever again. I'm a 31-year-old man, and the idea of someone just staring into my house through the windows gives me the kind of tense, anxious horror I felt when I almost fell off a 15-foot cliff. Can't even sit by windows at night without fully closing curtains. When my friend's dad was around 17 years old, he decided to go camping with about 8 or so of his friends. This took place in the Wisconsin forest. When they got to the site, they decided to split up to collect firewood in groups of 2 and meet back at the site in around 20 minutes. One group wasn't back right away, and since they were a couple, they just assumed they were fornicating in some bushes and cracked a couple jokes about it. After around an hour, they decided they should probably go look for them, and headed off to search in the area they had been collecting wood. They saw behind a bush part of the girl's bloody shirt, and the man's shoes were lying scattered around the scene. They quickly rushed back to their car so they could drive to the park ranger's office, which was about 5 miles away, and report the incident. However, they found that their gas had been siphoned, so they had no choice but to walk. On their walk back to the office, they saw a semi pass by with 1 driver and 2 faces pressed up against the window, which they believed were their friends begging for help. The 2 friends were reported missing and have never been found to this day. I saw a man get shot pretty much point blank in the face in the early 2000s. I was in a bar in Moscow waiting for a friend, chatting with the bartender. I hear a commotion next to me as I see a guy take a step back, whip out a gun, point at a guy's face, and pull a trigger. The guy just slumped and hit the floor, and that's when I saw blood. Immediate ringing in the ears, screams, and folks froze as we thought this guy will continue shooting. Turns out the guy was in the police force and shot this guy as he was part of some sort of gang who have murdered another cop from his station. I was around 10, very early 90s. We've just moved to Moscow from a small town in Siberia and bought new furniture. Turns out the furniture store forgot one of the items and said that someone will drop it off tomorrow. Not uncommon in Russia, kids were okay being home alone even at 10. So I'm home after school when 2 dudes knock on the door carrying a box, saying that they are from the furniture store. They were not. I got tied up and roughed up, and they robbed the house clean but left me alive. I was able to identify one of them a year later, while the other one was killed in a car accident. Karma's a bitch. The first guy got 7 years of hard labor, and I'm sure has been releasing silent farts from the first day there. Also Moscow 93, when Yeltsin decided to fire upon the Duma. Just the amount of dead people laid out to be identified by their relatives, wailing mothers and wives. The smell of burnt rubber and crackling glass under feet. What struck me the most was how there would be a janitor next to some bigwig politicians laying there, side by side with their head propped up on the brick wall, all equal in death. That one scared me for a while, as of course my friend and I snuck out without our parents knowing. I guess the lesson learned there was that at the end of the game, all chess pieces go into the same box. I went to see a movie with a friend of mine. It was dark when we got out of the movie, and she offered me a ride home, but it was a pretty short walk, nice night, and I live in a really safe town, usually. So I start to walk home. I guess I should mention, I'm a woman, and a particularly small one. About 2 blocks into my walk, I hear yelling and screaming and moaning. I look, and these 2 guys in hoodies are kicking something, but I can't see what because there is the short cement wall blocking my view. They shout something, not at me, take off in the opposite direction, so I run to where they had been. That all happened very quickly. I get there, and there's this homeless man. It's really dark, but he's obviously hurting badly. He has a blanket. He was clearly sleeping when these guys came up and attacked him. I actually recognized him, not by name, but it is a small town and I've seen him around. He gets up and grabs his blanket and looks around for a minute. I try to talk to him, but he just can't really talk to me. He's quite mentally ill and has now been hit in the head. He's just terrified. He takes a couple of steps as I'm calling 911 and ends up under the streetlight. His head and face are covered in blood with some dirt caked over it, to the point I can't see any skin on his face. He's way too spooked to let me try to help. I'm explaining to 911 the situation, but mostly just begging for an ambulance. They want to know about the 2 guys, of course, but I didn't see them well and I have this guy bleeding from his head in front of me. And then he starts walking. I have no way to stop him, so I just follow a little bit behind because I don't want to be an extra thing that terrifies him, but I also need to update 911 where we are. We made it like 8 blocks before the fire truck intercepted us. I'm shocked he makes it that far. No one else is out. 911 keeps wanting me to give more detailed description, which is the one point I lost it a little bit. He's the only one guy covered in blood walking down the street name. Sorry, 911 operator. I cannot describe how relieved I was when the fire truck showed up. Police talked to me for a little bit, then they left. The guy had been transported and the fire truck was gone. All of a sudden everyone was gone and I was just standing there on an empty street in the dark. I took a step to start to walk home, now farther than where I started. I decided to call my friend instead. She drove back and took me home. The guy with the head injury lived. The 2 terrible humans who did that were never caught. I used to take care of a developmentally disabled man in a community protection program. He He had to be kept away from people because of his sudden violent outbursts. His parents were rich and bought an old farmhouse on 10 acres or so, about 4 miles out of town, so that he could be away from the public and not forced into a psych ward. For 4 years, I worked there on a 56-hour shift, come in on a Sunday evening and leave Wednesday afternoon. There were 2 of us on these shifts, and we were both supposed to be there for the entire 56 hours, but because we were most senior trainers on staff, we'd take turns going home on 1 or 2 of the nights. After 3 years of being in that house, I'd become comfortable with it, despite it being isolated and overall kind of creepy. I'd always stay up and watch TV until around midnight. The client was always locked in his room around 8 p.m. One night, about 12:15 a.m., I turned the TV off and pulled the covers over myself to try and get some sleep on the nastiest futon ever. There was one window in the staff room, and it faced the back of the property, and was about 6 feet off the ground. I had just started drifting to sleep when I heard the most blood-curdling woman's scream from right outside the window. I popped up so fast that I nearly lost consciousness and had to steady myself in the doorway while the scream continued and then faded away. I grabbed a flashlight from the laundry room and threw open the back door, illuminating the area outside the window. There was nothing. I ran along the perimeter of the house and saw nothing. I watched the sun come up in the next morning, desperately glued to the TV, trying to distract myself from what had happened. All of the people I worked with were much older than me. There was no good reason to play a prank like that in the middle of January in eastern Oregon. I'm sure there's an explanation, but it bothers me to this day. Not necessarily paranormal, but this was something that both creeped me out quite thoroughly and chilled my blood to ice water. I was working at a crematory funeral home at the time. I had just picked up the body of a girl my age from the county coroner's office and was going through the check-in procedure, which consisted of lots of paperwork, fingerprints, documentation of belongings, etc. Now, when a body comes to us from the coroner, it's typically an unexpected death that occurred under questionable circumstances. This particular one, I could tell by simply looking at her, was a drug overdose. She had very obvious injection sites in her arms, thigh, and on her foot, and what appeared to be needle marks all over her lower abdomen. It looked like this chick went to fucking town, stabbing herself in the belly. This is strange to me, because I know that isn't a typical place to inject drugs, especially because this girl was a bit on the large side, nor is it usually a place where the pathologist will draw fluids in a case like this. Anyway, I shrugged it off and began to document her personal items, which come to us zipped up in the body bag in a black trash bag. Usually the coroner's office provides a detailed list of belongings for liability reasons. This case came with no such list, so it surprised me to see that she did indeed have a property bag with her, tucked under her leg. I tore the bag open and out flopped a fully developed, completely green, dead baby with a very smooshed head. You can imagine my shock, opening the bag, expecting to find shoes, clothes, maybe a wallet, and instead a tiny human plopping out. Long story short, family did not know, and telling them was horrifying in and of itself. There was absolutely no sort of documentation on this fully developed human, and the coroner was just as shocked as we were. Some jackass autopsy tech had just stuffed the baby in a bag in hopes of us not finding it and cremating it to save themselves some time on paperwork and dealing with an already distraught family. Autopsy was done on the baby, family and friends were questioned, the whole 9 yards. Later, a friend of the deceased disclosed that she was the only one who the girl told about being pregnant and her plans to try and give herself a late-stage abortion by injecting heroin straight into her womb. Pretty fucked. Needless to say, I was always hesitant when opening property bags in fear of finding another dead, green infant as opposed to a pair of Nikes. I was home for the summer from college. My mother and brother had just headed out for a few day trip to visit colleges. This meant I was to take care of my father. Dad, something was clearly wrong, but we couldn't tell what. He had Parkinson's, but it was more than that. But we figured I could handle him. This is when I came to realize something in his broken mind hated me with a passion. He wouldn't listen to anything I said. Now I admit I was pissed off, so I wasn't doing a terrific job, but even simple things like getting him food was an hour-long ordeal that ended up with us shouting. This last time I called Mom in the house phone because at least he'd listen to her. I gave him one phone and I was on another, yelling at each other through it even though we were 5 feet apart. Poor Mom trying to referee from a few hundred miles away. Finally, Dad hangs up his phone and hands it to me. Oh, he's done, thank God, I think. But then he tries to take the still active phone from my hand, which I refuse, and that's when it happens. It gives me the chills to this day. A change came over him. It was subtle, but he stood slightly straighter. It was like for a moment someone else was in his body. He stared at me, and in the most calm, cold voice I've ever heard, said, "I'm going to kill you." There was no emotion behind it. There was no energy. He said it as a fact. I was stunned. Mom heard it over the phone. As I stood there, paralyzed, her voice broke through in a whisper. "Key. Run." I threw the phone at Dad, rounded the corner, and grabbed my keys. My car screamed out the driveway. It was pure animal instinct for me at that point. I had to run, because if I stayed there... Dad didn't really remember what happened. He was confused as to why I was suddenly gone. I have no idea what went on in his head at that moment, but I stared into something back there